Hello, everyone. Today, I'm excited to welcome back Professor Salvatore Babones. He is out with his new book, Dharma Democracy: How India Built the Third World's First Democracy, which he is displaying it on the screen, and which I'll link below later in the description as well. So, Professor Babones, thank you for sending me an advanced copy. I absolutely enjoyed the book, and congratulations on the book, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Fantastic to talk to you.
I would like to summarize the book in two sentences. Just let me know if it's a fair assessment. So, for me, the book challenges the preconceived notions long held by Western academia about Indian democracy using data and empirical evidence. It illustrates how Westerners have come to underappreciate the third world's first democracy. Would that be a fair assessment of the book?
Fair enough in two sentences, or I can give it to you in one. Dharma is the basis of democracy, which Asia must recognize. For in this lies the distinction between the soul of Asia and the soul of Europe. Of course, that's not me, that's Sri Aurobindo.
So, why do you think the Western countries have underappreciated India's democracy and how it has survived for the past 75 years? Because, like you said, India is still a relatively poor country and not industrialized compared to the Western countries.
The biggest problem is that it's easy to confuse poverty and lack of democracy. The simple fact is that virtually every functioning democracy in the world is a rich country, and virtually every poor country in the world is a dysfunctional democracy or an autocracy of some kind. India is the only country that has consistently bucked that trend. Now, people will tell me, what about this country? What about that country? You can't find a country with a GDP per capita of less than $10,000 that has been a democracy for more than about 20 or 25 years. Will they remain democracies? I don't know. But if you're looking for a well-institutionalized democracy on a budget, you're left with India. Now, the second problem is simple racism. Call it neocolonialism if you want, call it snobbery if you want. But the same things happen in a country like Australia versus India, or in a country like the United Kingdom versus India. If they happen in Australia and the UK, we shrug it off because we know they're democracies. That's fine. But if the same thing happens in India, it's evidence of autocracy. And that generalization feeds into all sorts of comments I get from very well-informed people, journalists, think tankers. When they see I've written this book, they ask me, well, what about this in India? And I'll say, well, actually, that happens here as well. You just don't notice it here.
So you have used a data to counter all the judgments made by the institutions like the VDEM Institute. So do you think that your book will set a new standard on how Indian policymakers and politicians can counter these allegations by these institutions?
Well, first, the way we get around our generalizations, our tendency to see what we're looking for is to go to the hard data. So I'll just give one example on academic freedom. India is repeatedly criticized for lack of academic freedom, and you can point to examples of academics in India who have been either hounded out of their job or been pressured or have even been literally fired because of their political points of view. It does happen. My question as a systematic quantitative social scientist is, how often does it happen? And so in the book, I do a little study. I track the numbers of academics who've lost their jobs, paid jobs, not honorary positions that they resigned in a huff, actual paid jobs in, on the one hand, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, who have a very similar academic system to India, and on the other hand, India. Now, over the last 5 years, more academics have been fired explicitly for their political positions in these Western countries than in India, despite the fact that India has 10 times the population of these Western countries combined. So, in fact, on a purely quantitative basis, academic jobs are more secure in India than they are in Western countries with similar educational systems. And that pattern replicates itself over nearly all of the metrics that I'm able to verify quantitatively, that India actually is not just a good democracy on that basis, it's a great democracy on that basis. And people may think it's ridiculous to say that. How can that be true? Well, the numbers don't lie. Now, on the other hand, if you look to expert evaluations, the expert evaluations of India are abysmal. According to the expert evaluations, India has, if you ask Western experts, India has a level of democracy about the level of Eastern Europe or Latin America. If you ask Indian experts, as the Variety of Democracy Institute does, India's democracy is one of actually the worst democracy in the world, and it's worse than many countries that don't even have democracies, that don't even have elections. So this is the difference between data-driven analysis and expert-driven analysis. Now, unfortunately, the Indian government doesn't seem very interested in this. They say quite correctly, well, it's not for anyone else to judge our democracy, it's for our own voters. And while that's technically correct, while that has a certain moral force to it, it does nothing to change opinions in the West about Indian democracy.
And is it important for Indian policymakers to keep this in mind that they must challenge the notions and even kind of try to change the mindset of Western policymakers and even play to the Western audience? Because a lot of low level officials in the bureaucracies in the Western countries would think that India is, like you said, described as a very dangerous democracy or a declining democracy.
India does virtually no public diplomacy on this topic. India's public diplomacy is seemingly restricted to entirely non-controversial topics like the promotion of yoga or the promotion of Indian classical music, which is fine, but countries like China and Russia also promote their culture. Promoting your culture doesn't say you're a democracy; it just says there's something interesting about your country. And of course, every country has an interesting culture. There's music everywhere. There's spirituality everywhere. India has no monopoly on these things. Unfortunately, as I keep saying, India's Ministry of External Affairs just doesn't want to push this message, and I don't know why. The data are there to support a robust defense of Indian democracy, but they don't take it up.
When
I
it
mean, no
comes
one, to my knowledge, no one at MEA or government has mentioned or tweeted about this book. And this, and this book is the first major analysis of Indian democracy in the last 25 years. I mean, it's the first comprehensive investigation of Indian democracy, literally this century, and it's very positive. The outcomes are very positive for India. No one's mentioned it.
Seriously, I mean, Indian policymakers should utilize your book to counter the fallacious arguments that is made by the Western media. And when it comes to freedom of expression, even I had my preconceived notions about Indian media and how it's supposedly not free. But you use data to counter that argument and uh,
Yeah.
state that India is one of the safest countries to do journalism. But I would
There
also
are,
like
well,
to,
I'm sorry to cut you off. There are challenges to freedom of expression in India. And if you're a journalist, you see that and you say, oh, India is not perfect. My job as a social scientist is to ask systematically, how do the challenges of freedom of expression in India compare to the challenges of freedom of expression in the rest of the world? So internet censorship in India is a real thing. But Australia has an internet censorship law. The European Union has internet censorship laws. The United Kingdom has internet censorship laws. The United States, under the Biden administration, was very actively censoring the internet. So the question is, do democracies do this? Well, everyone agrees that Australia, European Union, United Kingdom, United States, so these are all democratic countries or areas. And if we agree that they have reasonable freedom of expression despite the media censorship, then I have to conclude that India's level of media repression, even though I don't agree with it, even though I fully believe in an entirely free media, yet if other countries that we rate highly for freedom of expression do the same things India does, then this can't count against India. And that's really the whole rationale of the book. It is a benchmarking exercise.
Also, I would like to get your comments on how I have observed. Uh, I have observed that the Western media used to be relatively free in the past decade, and due to political polarization, I have observed that the Western media, especially the television media and the print media, they just reproduce the establishment narratives. So, how can they expect an upcome like a developing country like India to be perfect in that sense?
Lack of media diversity is a great example. So India is repeatedly criticized for lack of media diversity. And I'm going to be honest with you, when the Adani firm bought NDTV, I thought, that's terrible for media diversity in India. It's really good for India to have a highly critical English language news channel like NDTV holding the government to account. I thought that's sad to see it happen. But when we look at Indian media, including post-purchase NDTV, versus Western media, we see much more bias in those Western media channels, the established media channels. Indian TV, people might hate them, they might make fun of them, but Indian TV routinely runs panels in which every point of view is represented by 6 or 8 different people on the panel, each of whom get the chance to have their say. That doesn't happen in panel shows in the West, where panels are absolutely stacked all on one side. In fact, legacy TV in the United States and in Australia is called legacy TV precisely because people are not watching it because it's boring, because the panels are all stacked on one side. Australia just discontinued its flagship, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the state-owned media in Australia, just discontinued its flagship panel discussion program called Q&A, question and answer, because they would routinely get 5 panelists on who all agreed. And they all agreed with the ABC's and the government's point of view on the topic. And so no one wanted to watch this show. Well, if that happened in India, I mean, if major Indian media, I mean, Doordarshan's not quite the equivalent of the ABC or the BBC, but if major Indian media were running panel discussions with 5 members who all agreed with the government on a particular policy, we would rightly deride this as evidence of tacit government control of the media in India. Well, it happens in Australia. It happened under the Biden administration in the United States. I mean, you can watch The View or other morning shows on US TV, and you'll have 4 or 5
DC.
people who have the exact same point of view. So again, I don't endorse that. I don't think it's a good practice. But as a social scientist, it's not for me to judge. I mean, I can't judge what's good or bad. There's no absolute standard where I can say that every democracy is a 1 on a scale from 0 to 10 because they all have these low levels of media diversity. Instead, we have to ask countries that we recognize as having free media and democratic governance, if they have the same or less media diversity than India, then the Indian media has to be regarded as largely free. And we not only make these benchmarks internationally, in the book, I make these benchmarks over time. So, for example, civil society repression in India is rated worse by the Varieties of Democracy Institute today than during the emergency. Now, during the emergency, 26 major civil society organizations were banned, including the RSS and the Jamaat Islami. Hindu and Muslim organizations were banned. More than 100,000 people, including members of parliament, were imprisoned. Now, how could civil society repression today be worse than it was in 1975, 76 in India? It's inconceivable, right? So again, I can't trust this evaluation because I can objectively compare the 2 eras in Indian history, which on the Varieties of Democracy Institute scale are being benchmarked to the same descriptors. The same analysts are being provided the same descriptors, but they're giving the same answer for 1976 and 2025 for civil society repression. That's inconceivable. And I do this repeatedly in the book for metric after metric. Wherever we can find a quantifiable metric, we go to it.
That is something which the government will have to ponder about how to counter these allegations. So now I would like to come to the Nehruvian era in your book, where
Yeah,
you mentioned
I
that
am not a big fan of Nehru.
where you mentioned that his government, and even in the subsequent years, that the government and the establishment try to write history in a way that it would kind of, they were scared that it would turn India into a Hindu majoritarianism country. So do you think the new establishment, including the new historians who have emerged during the BJP rule, have done enough to counter uh, and bring up what and all we didn't learn during the Nehruvian years?
First, let me say that Nehru was the archetype of the third world dictator. Now, I know that's highly controversial to say in India, that's highly controversial to say in Western academia, but he was the archetype in the sense that everything he did changed the Constitution to uh, to get rid of freedom of speech protections, change the Constitution to allow himself to nationalize industries, suppress all opposition parties, censor the press, stay in office until the moment he died, arranged to be succeeded by his daughter. This set the pattern for dozens of countries that came after India. Because remember, India was the first country to become independent after World War II. The other countries followed India's example, and the other leaders followed Nehru's example. So I think he was a real tragedy for Indian democracy. That said, the Nehruvian consensus around history was to create a history that somewhat whitewashed the history of Muslim conquest in India, that whitewashed atrocities, that whitewashed temple desecrations, that even to some extent whitewashed the uh, violence of Muslims during a partition itself, and to kind of erase that from Indian history. Well, look, the intention behind that was noble. The intention was to create an environment that would be more accepting of Muslim Indians. And credit where credit's due, that is a good intention. However, it did not have that effect. And so, during the period of Congress rule, there was far more intercommunal violence in India than after the era of Congress rule came to an end. And I think there was more violence because no one ever bought that history, right? Everyone knew it was fake. I don't know that empirically. I can just say that if I were reading that history and my family had a knowledge of its own history, that I would have thought it was fake. Now, there's been a response that goes far too far the other direction. So people who have correctly said that old history we were taught at school was extraordinarily biased, selective, it was wrong, we need to correct it. But of course, there's been an overcorrection. And that overcorrection has tended towards the narrative that everyone Muslim in India's history was evil, that tens of thousands of temples were desecrated, that there were huge massacres of Hindus in India by Muslims, that that the world was, that Hindus. I mean, we can get to the extreme versions of ancient Hindus developing helicopters and airplanes and spaceships, and of course, all of that is also quite ridiculous. Hopefully, what will happen is the needle will land in the middle towards an honest engagement with history that admits the Muslim temple desecrations, but also admits that most Hindu temples, by sheer number, not the famous ones, not Mathura or Kashi, most of those village temples that were converted to mosques were converted because the people who worship at them converted from Hindu faith to Muslim faith. And this was just their village religious spot. And that village religious building, which was a temple, became a mosque. And we know this historically. We have actually good historical evidence for this in the 19th century, that during the Deobandi movement, Muslim Deobandi missionaries were going out to villages, particularly in Assam and Bengal. They were going out to villages, finding mosques that still had an idol in them. Literally, the old village idol was still in the mosque. And these Deobandis were saying, oh, you can't have an idol. Islam is Islam doesn't allow idols. And it was only at that point in 1890 or 1895 that the idol was finally removed from the mosque, right? So we know this process occurred. Let's have an honest historical reckoning. Now that is happening. Mostly young, new empirically oriented historians in India are trying to get an accurate record, not a political record. So if instead of reading, the big name books at the airport bookstore or in the bookstore window, if you go to careful academic work being done on Indian history, it is correcting towards a well supported, empirically based narrative.
Fair enough.